Okay, so this first article that we have is just an update on coronavirus. As usual, regardless of what you hear on this podcast, it's always good to go to the CDC's website and get that information on your own, and maybe read through something that might be more particular to your personal circumstances. So, Elliot, what did we find out from the CDC and reopening strategies as they relate to travel?
You know, this was actually, I can thank my wife for this because we were talking about this week, and we're kind of getting to the point where we want to see people and we're not sure if we can. And according to the CDC, which has very specific guidelines and they rank them as low risk, medium risk, high risk, and everywhere in between, that as long as you're staying, 6 feet apart, that it's not a highly social area like pools and beaches, they said, are pretty much okay. Beaches are better than pools because there's more space. And as long as you're not visiting family or friends that are at extremely high risk or that they've had it, then you're likely going to be okay. And obviously, there are a lot of different conditions that apply. So make sure you check out the website and the CDC's website, just to clarify. They talk about considerations for people thinking about travel. And then if you already are traveling, they have a whole list of considerations for those that need to travel. It's very, very valuable. It's not worth running through the whole thing. Just check it out.
Yeah.
And to add to that, there is a website. We will have it in our travel notes and our newsletter. It's iatatravelcenter.com, and they have a map of the world that shows which countries are totally restrictive to travel, partially restrictive, or if they have no regulations related to COVID-19.
Okay. So this first article that you added to our Travel Bites episode is related to the Cook Islands, and we don't talk about the Cook Islands a lot. And for those of you who might not know where they are, they're way out in the Pacific. They're like almost due south of Hawaii, kind of due west of almost Lima, Peru, just really out in the middle of nowhere. So what's going on in the Cook Islands? Why did we have them? Why are we going to talk about them today?
Well, I think this actually came from Bloomberg, and I thought this was a really interesting article because it basically is a case study of nations and cities that really focus on tourism to survive. And this nation, the Cook Islands, took it upon themselves to sacrifice all of the income from tourism so that they could preserve tourism later, so they could protect the people that live in their country. And they are projected to have a gross domestic product 60% less than they did last year, which
Wow.
is huge. And it's paid off. Like they have, granted, they only have 18,000 people and they are very isolated to begin with. But since, 50% of the people that come that are on that island at any given time are tourists, they haven't had a single case of COVID-19.
Wow. So they're going to wait this out. I'd be curious to see when they think that it's appropriate, because are they going to wait for zero cases, or are they going to allow Americans to come there and maybe quarantine for a few weeks? I'm curious to see how they actually continue to preserve this as things open up, and eventually they will need that extra income. So
They
that's
will.
it's a very interesting approach. It's great that they didn't get a single case. I know a nearby nation, American Samoa, also did not get a single case of coronavirus. Now, I should say that I didn't check today. I didn't check even this week. But when I did read about American Samoa, they did not contract any coronavirus cases there. So these island nations being so isolated, it was a little bit easier. And I am going to be curious to see how they try to open back up to the tourism dollars that they so heavily rely on,
Yeah.
while keeping these cases to zero.
Yeah. But I
Zero.
think that's a broader conversation of what is travel going to look like? We're going to have different things to think about when we travel now because COVID-19 isn't going to go away
No.
anytime soon. And there are considerations that travel might not open up until 2022, which would
Right.
be absolutely devastating. It's already been devastating to every single major like tourist country.
Well, what about the correspondence that we've had with a guest who will be coming out next month, Paulo of Perth? I don't know if you saw the correspondence. I was going back with him in our DMs on our Instagram page, and
Yeah.
he's saying that Australia might not allow international travel even for someone, even for an Australian citizen, until 2023. So you're not even going to be able to leave the island until 2023 for travel. We didn't really get deep into the conversation, so I don't know exactly what's going on there, but it's
And it's all
in our
speculation until it actually happens.
right. They're throwing around the idea of not letting anybody leave until 2023. And from what I'm understanding now with traveling to Australia and New Zealand, I don't think you and I as Americans can expect to go until then either.
Yeah.
They did a really good job of limiting the amount of cases. They brought it down to a very low number. And I don't think they're going to be very open to just allowing anybody to come in anymore, which is
No, I
unfortunate
think
because New Zealand was the country that we kind of were planning on going to next.
it is
So
really unfortunate, and it's a
yeah,
big bummer. And I think the only way countries are going to allow tourism to restart is if there is a global system of a global database to check if you have had COVID-19, if you were exposed to it, or if you're immune to it.
right. Yeah. I mean, speaking on people that we've talked to as well, something to just throw in there. I was talking to Matt Waugh, who is a close friend of the podcast. And
Yeah.
now he's a
Trek
guy that
hoppers.
Trek Hoppers Peru. He takes people to Machu Picchu. He does the whole sustainable tourism um, thing in Peru. He got stuck in Colombia. And when things started to close down, he got isolated in Colombia. He's married. He has a wife in Peru. He lives in Pisac, but he could not travel from Colombia to Peru because of the lockdown. And because he's a resident of Peru, but he's not a citizen of Peru, they wouldn't allow him to travel. And South America, countries like Colombia and Peru have put extremely harsh lockdowns on their citizens. I mean, if you're an American listening to this, or a European or Canadian, and and you think that the lockdowns were strict here, look into what they did in South America, in countries like Peru, Colombia, maybe even Ecuador. I mean, police were monitoring the streets, and so he got stuck there with limited supplies, limited internet. I mean, when I would talk back and forth with him, I said, "Hey, do you want to come on the podcast?" He doesn't have the Wi-Fi to do it. He only has a certain amount of clothes that he's ran through. He can still go on hikes, so he'd go out into the wilderness and he'd explore different hikes and kind of try to figure out new trails that he could operate with once he gets back into business. But he hiked through his shoes, through the soles of his shoes,
Oh
and you
yeah, I
can't
saw that.
yeah, and we can't even mail him shoes because
Wow.
so he's just stuck there. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He's getting frustrated, and it's just an unbelievably hard time for him right now. And that's just another idea of that's a completely different content moving from Australia to South America, and that's kind of what we're hearing is going on there. Bringing it back to Venice, I've talked to Igor, a friend of the
Yeah.
podcast, who operates the company Tour Leader Venice, and he is saying that Italy has opened up as under this new normal. Bars are open, restaurants are open, people are walking the streets again. They haven't allowed in foreign tourists yet, but people are out and about in cities like Venice, which is an incredibly tiny city where everybody's on top of each other. They're trying to maneuver through this new normal in this post-coronavirus
Yeah,
world. So
unless you're in one of the squares, I don't think you can get 6 feet of separation between those walkways.
I think that was one of the biggest issues with Italy in general is that, or Europe. I mean, Italy and Spain, you have these cities that were developed pre-car. They were developed for
Yeah,
the walking person. They're tiny, narrow streets.
and maybe a
They're
chariot.
maybe a chariot, right, yeah. But the cities were designed around walking, and so they're on top of each other. And it's just, I mean, I found it very interesting to talk to the friends that we've made on this podcast in on different continents in different countries, and hey, what's going on there? It's been cool to be able to do that and have those connections.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get into the electric plane, why don't we just stay on the subject of COVID-19 and talk about
Sure.
specific countries and how they plan to lift restrictions if they do intend to, and what their plans are for the near future.
Yeah, so something I want to mention before we even get into this is that for a majority of these countries, these European Union countries that we're going to talk about, and then maybe a little bit of South American ones, there's no mention of U.S. travelers being allowed in for EU countries. So let me just say that again because I kind of bounced around. For majority of the European Union countries, there's still no mention for U.S. travelers to enter them. Most of these openings from June into July are only for EU citizens that can then travel across those borders. That's kind of where this is right now.
Hmm.
Um, Elliot,
And
if you go
yeah,
ahead.
to add to that, so other countries are forming, as the CNN article talked about, travel bubbles. And Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are basically letting their citizens travel within their countries, almost like one country.
Right,
But we're not seeing that in many other places. I guess the
right.
EU is kind of doing that.
It's easy for the EU to create travel bubbles, but I think you're also going to see the travel bubble with Australia and New
New
Zealand.
Zealand.
They'll have their
Yeah.
own travel bubble. I did see something about some of the Balkan countries creating a travel bubble, Croatia and Bosnia, Montenegro. Those countries that share tourism and, well, yeah, I mean, share tourism within each other.
Hmm.
They're going to create their own travel bubble. Maybe we'll create one with Canada. I don't know.
Maybe.
That would
Or
make sense.
Mexico.
Canada and Mexico, right? Mexico's
Yeah.
a huge travel destination for Americans. So, but I still don't think there's any significant opening of just international travel where Americans can just freely travel to Europe. I haven't read about it yet. Maybe we haven't seen the article, but it doesn't seem to be going that route, at least for the first half of summer.
Yeah. And so the first country that we talked about, or we're going to talk about, is France. And this one actually kind of mentions not specifically United States citizens, but non-EU citizens. And anyone outside of the EU will be subject to a compulsory 14-day coronavirus quarantine until at least July 24th.
Yeah, yeah, it's
And I wouldn't be surprised if other EU countries adopted that same policy.
right. I didn't realize France was the most visited country in the world before coronavirus pandemic. I would have maybe given that to Italy, but
Yeah.
so countries like Germany. Germany is lifting restrictions for outside travel on June 15th for other EU nations.
Yeah.
Thailand's borders are firmly shut down for the time being.
It
We didn't
doesn't
see
seem like they
anything.
have a time frame.
Right. They were hit relatively hard as far as Southeastern Asian countries go, but nothing like we saw in the United States. Um, Mexico, right? They're aiming to welcome visitors back within weeks. Now, I don't know if that's Americans as well.
I
It
believe it is.
okay, so they're, I mean, yeah, so they'll open up to Americans.
Yeah. And we actually have an episode coming out in August about Oaxaca in Mexico.
Yeah, yeah. And Italy, the country that I was supposed to be visiting in September, started opening or will start to open on June 3rd for people from the EU and the UK and other principalities within Italy, like the Vatican, for example. Does anybody live in the Vatican other than the people who work there?
I don't know. That's a great
I don't
question,
see.
Bob.
Right. Yeah.
Another time.
Yeah. Yeah. A question for another time. So,
Yeah. And then the UK is basically doing what France is doing for all travelers outside of the EU will be required to self-isolate for a 14-day period. And they actually may require EU citizens to as well.
yeah. And Spain, from what I understand right now, if you were to visit Spain as a EU resident, you would be subject to quarantine. However, in July, they actually plan on removing that 2 week quarantine period and allowing you to travel within the country. But again, still no mention of Americans, North Americans, or people of any other nation being able to travel within Spain at this point in time.
Yep. So that wraps up
So,
our travel bites. Actually, sorry, I completely
no, yeah,
forgot
yeah, that wraps up our coronavirus
our
talk.
coronavirus travel.
Right.
Yep.
And
So
get into something that I love how you're
I'm
so passionate
passionate.
about this. You are, and I'm glad you are because I also am passionate. I mean, I am also incredibly interested in it, but you make sure that it stays in the forefront of my mind. And the technological advancements that we have in the electric world stay relevant to me.
Yeah.
So I'll let you take it from here.
So this is a